Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. So glad you're joining me today because we're jumping straight into something I like to call the macro to micro climate puzzle. We hear about climate change all the time, right? But usually it's framed as this massive, abstract global crisis that honestly feels totally disconnected from our everyday lives. Well, today, we're going to bridge that gap. We're tracing the lines from the very top, international negotiations and national policy, right down into our schools, our communities, and literally into your living room. By the end of this, you'll see exactly how the big global picture and your personal habits are completely intertwined.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's a massive question for you. How on earth do you balance lifting millions of people out of poverty while simultaneously saving the planet? It's arguably the defining challenge of our century, and honestly, nowhere are the stakes higher right now than in India. Think about it. With 1.4 billion people, that's nearly 18% of the entire human population, India is walking this monumental geopolitical tightrope. They absolutely have to sustain this incredible development boom to pull millions out of poverty, expand energy access, and build infrastructure. But they have to do all of that while fighting off the very real immediate threats of global climate change.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start big with the global climate challenge, then look at how we're building resilience against vulnerability. After that, we'll dive into India's environmental laws, see how students are actually driving community change, and finally look at practical ways you can shrink your own carbon footprint.
All right, starting with part one, the global climate challenge.
To really wrap our heads around this, we're pulling from some fantastic academic research, specifically a comprehensive analysis called Global Warming: Causes, Impacts, and Mitigation Strategies. This work does a brilliant job of outlining India's totally unique position. See, India is actually the world's third largest emitter of greenhouse gases in absolute terms. But, and this is a huge but, because of its massive population, its per capita emissions are actually incredibly low. This research really helps us unpack that crazy tension between India's urgent need for economic growth and its responsibility on the global climate stage. And this breakdown brilliantly illustrates where those emissions are actually coming from. Unsurprisingly, energy dominates at 75%, mostly because coal is still the backbone of the country's electricity generation. But look at that 14% for agriculture. You might be wondering, how is farming taking up such a huge slice of the pie? Well, here is a wild fact. India has the world's largest area of flooded rice paddies, and those paddies generate massive amounts of methane. Combine that with the world's largest cattle population, which, you guessed it, also produces a ton of methane through digestion, and it suddenly makes perfect sense why agriculture is such a huge piece of this emissions puzzle.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the stark contrast when we talk about international climate equity. On one hand, you have developed nations who are responsible for about 60% of all cumulative carbon emissions since the 1850s. But on the other hand, your average person in India today emits only about 2.4 tons of CO2. To put that in perspective, that's less than half the global average and roughly 1/6 of what the average American emits. This gap is literally at the heart of global climate negotiations. It constantly forces the question, who bears the historical responsibility here and who actually gets to use the remaining carbon budget to develop?
Moving on to section 2, vulnerability and resilience building.
Because look, a changing climate isn't just some abstract future threat. It is happening right now. Just since 1950, India has seen a 75% increase in extreme rainfall events. And that's not just a statistic. That translates into terrifying human realities. We saw exactly this with the devastating Kerala floods back in 2018, which displaced over 1 million people. And when you consider that more than half of India's agriculture depends entirely on the rain, these wildly erratic monsoons, which bring either long dry spells or sudden catastrophic flooding, are a direct threat to the livelihoods of millions of farmers.
The economic fallout from all this is honestly staggering. If we don't mitigate these impacts, we're looking at a potential 2.8% loss of India's entire GDP by 2050. But it's not even just about the money. It's about basic food security. Thanks to rising temperatures and intense heat stress, projections are showing that wheat yields in India could drop anywhere from 6% to 25% by 2050. I mean, when you are trying to feed 1.4 billion people, a 25% drop in a core staple crop, that is a full-blown national emergency.
But the crucial point here is that we aren't just sitting around waiting for doom to arrive. Systemic adaptation is already happening across so many sectors. In agriculture, scientists are rapidly developing climate-resilient, drought-tolerant seeds. For water scarcity, it's not just about flashy modern tech.
It's about reviving ancient traditional water harvesting systems alongside modern rainwater pits to recharge the groundwater. And in those rapidly growing urban centers, we're seeing real heat action plans being rolled out. Early warning systems, public cooling shelters, things that actively save lives during heat waves. This is exactly what it looks like when macro policy hits the pavement.
That brings us to Section 3, India's environmental laws.
For this part, we're pulling some great insights from a really fascinating academic paper published in Hindi in the International Journal of Humanities and Education Research. What this text beautifully highlights is how deeply environmentalism and conservation aren't just modern policy add-ons. They're actually embedded deep within the foundational legal philosophy of the country itself.
Because protecting nature in India isn't just a modern trend, it is actually a fundamental civic duty, literally enshrined in the Indian Constitution. Article 51A explicitly states that every single citizen has a duty to protect and improve the natural environment. We're talking forests, lakes, wildlife, and to have compassion for living creatures. It's woven right into the social contract of being a citizen.
And hey, this duty doesn't just fall on everyday people, it falls heavily on the government too. Article 48 mandates that the state itself must endeavor to protect and improve the environment. The specific constitutional mandate is so important because it acts as the bedrock for a really robust net of legislation. It empowers strong laws like the Wildlife Protection Act and the Forest Conservation Act. It basically ensures that conservation isn't just a nice suggestion. It is the absolute law of the land, backed by the highest legal authority.
All right, let's zoom in a bit for Section 4, Students Driving Community Change.
60%. Get this, research shows that over 60% of students who take part in environmental programs at school actually carry those sustainable, eco-friendly habits straight into adulthood. That is an absolutely massive retention rate for behavioral change. It really proves that the classroom is, without a doubt, the best incubator for lifelong climate action.
Let's move to how this builds when you give students some structure. The real-world environmental benefits are huge. For example, in Nordic countries, school recycling programs haven't just raised awareness, they've actually reduced campus waste by up to 40% over a 5-year period. That is tangibly less trash in landfills and fewer methane emissions, all completely driven by youth engagement.
I absolutely love this next example because it completely shatters all that climate doom we constantly hear. A student group in Finland put together a zero-waste week, just using awareness posters and simple behavioral nudges. And the result? No way, right? They slashed their cafeteria waste by 55% in a single week. It's such a brilliant, empowering reminder of how strong peer influence can be. When sustainable behavior gets normalized by your friends and classmates, it spreads like wildfire and creates immediate, measurable impact.
And finally, landing right in your lap. Section 5, shrinking your carbon footprint. Look, making your home sustainable shouldn't feel like a chore. These are highly actionable tips that are going to benefit the planet and, honestly, your bank account too. Upgrading to AAA energy-efficient appliances and improving your wall and window insulation, that drastically cuts down your heating and cooling load. Even just switching to LED bulbs can cut your lighting energy use by a whopping 80%. And fixing a leaky faucet or setting up a simple rainwater barrel saves the energy required to pump and treat municipal water. Every tiny bit of efficiency puts money right back in your pocket while cutting down emissions.
Lastly, let's talk about your daily consumption habits. Remember that agriculture data from earlier? Simply eating meat-free meals just a couple of days a week significantly shrinks your footprint. Buying secondhand cuts out the manufacturing and shipping emissions of brand new goods. And here is one of my favorite fun facts. Just adding houseplants to your living space turns your home into a mini carbon sink. Through photosynthesis, those gorgeous ferns and monsteras are literally pulling CO2 right out of your indoor air. And of course, whenever you can, ditch the car keys and out for a bike, public transport, or just walking.
Wow, okay. We've covered a massive amount of ground today, from international carbon budgets and constitutional laws all the way down to that LED bulb in your hallway. I know, it's so easy to feel small in the face of something like global warming, but as you've seen today, it's like a giant puzzle. Everything is connected. The macro policies demand the infrastructure, the schools build the culture, and you make the daily choices. So I want to leave you with this to think about. Look around your life right now. How might your smallest daily habit ripple outward into that global climate puzzle? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.